Hello, and welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. I am your host, Carles Salazar. Conversations in Culture and Evolution is a product of a work group of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology that goes by the name of Culture and Evolution. And in this work group, we are some anthropologists and archaeologists and happy with the way in which our disciplines were treating Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection and the relation between biology and culture in the explanation of human behavior. And to compensate for this deficiency, we organized this group. Now, today, our guest is Professor Robert McCauley from Emory University. Hello, Pop.
Hi, Carlos. Good to see you.
Welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. Now, Robert McCauley is Kenan University Professor of Philosophy at Emory University with associated appointments in psychology, religion, and anthropology. His specialization is in the philosophy of psychological and cognitive science of religion. His competence extends to the philosophy of social science, naturalized epistemology, philosophy of neuroscience, and recent moral theory. And he has interest in cognitive psychology, biological anthropology, foundations of education, cultural evolution, evolutionary biology, linguistics, and comparative religion. Professor McCauley is a pioneer in the cognitive science of religion. In his view, religions should be accounted for scientifically, which means that we should explain why humans have religious beliefs. His point is that we do not have a religious instinct or module, but that religion should be seen as a byproduct of our cognitive structure. And he also has done comparative analysis of religion and science. In his view, our minds are better suited to religious belief than to scientific inquiry because the explanations that religion provides make intuitive sense to us and engage our natural cognitive systems. While science involves abstract thinking and forms of reflection that require a lot of mental work. And now let me show you some of the books. Uh, and here are some of the books that Professor McCauley has published. All of them, as you can see, having religion as a central topic of research, and very, very interesting books, I think, for anthropologists and archaeologists and for anyone in the social sciences. And of all of them, let me just mention one, which is the one that you see at the bottom, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. And why do I mention this book? Well, all the books are very good, but this one in particular, I think it's worth mentioning because it provides what I believe is a fully anthropological perspective on the study of religion and science. And by an anthropological perspective, I mean a perspective, a species perspective, a perspective from the history of the human species, which I think is what anthropologists should do actually. And unfortunately, is not what they do most of the time. So if you want to learn what an anthropological perspective on this very important topic, so a very important cultural construct, such as religion and science is or looks like, you can take a look at this book. Now let me, okay, right. And another thing that Professor McCauley has done among his merits and awards is that he was a Gifford lecturer. And for those of you who don't know what Gifford lectures are, these are lectures that are given in Scottish University every year and on a general topic having to do with religion, science, and theology in general terms. And they are very prestigious lectures. They have been given for a long time, since the end of the 19th century. And just to give you an idea of how prestigious these lectures are, among the Gifford lecturers, there was no other than William James, the great philosopher, American philosopher and psychologist. So we are really very, very privileged to have Professor McCauley with us today. Now, Bob, let me ask you the question that we ask all our guests. What has been the relevance of Darwinian theory in your research and in the study of religion in general?
Well, I came to Darwin not at all reluctantly, but somewhat, it took a while because my principal interests really initially had to do with what I would call the cognitive revolution in psychology and in sort of the birth of cognitive science. Um, the It was probably interactions with Dan Sperber, quite frankly, that started both Tom Lawson, my collaborator, and I to start pondering the evolutionary connections. And, sort of one might say the rest is history, if you know that American saying. There are a plethora of theories that are out there about religion that appeal to Darwin and Darwinian type of thinking, evolutionary thinking. We've chatted about this a bit. I thought what I might do to sort of make this economical is just to share a slide that I've got. So let me do that. I guess I want number 3 here. And so to sort of situate all the options that are out there, it seems valuable, first of all, to draw some distinctions that are post-Darwinian, having to do with additional mechanisms of selection and different levels or units of selection. Obviously, Darwin did not know about Mendelian genes. I gather Mendel sent him the paper, but the view seems to be that Darwin never read it. But this creates a kind of 3 by 3 matrix here when we look at natural selection, sexual selection, and cultural selection. Cultural selection, of course, is a very new concept in the last 40, 50 years or so. It's really kind of hit its stride, you might say, though arguably Darwin anticipated it. Sexual selection, of course, was Darwin's own creation. But in effect, looking at each of these levels, the genetic, the individual, the group level, and these different mechanisms, they're really a host of mechanisms and levels, right? There's a whole pile of theories out there that fit into this framework in one way or another. There are folks who, starting with natural selection, I have in mind people like Jesse Beering, Joseph Obuya, Rich Sosis, and Dunbar, and others, who hold that, in short, there's reasons to believe that there's been natural selection for religiosity. The arguments have to do with things typically like making it conspicuous that you're a good person to cooperate with, or looking to things like the benefits for what seems to be both our health generally and our psychological health in particular. Then there are sort of the group that I'm with, and that's the byproduct theorists. It's not to say, sorry, let me back up and just make one quick comment. There's a whole host of theories and folks who have advanced these theories represented in this slide, one crucial thing to keep in mind is that all of these could be perfectly consistent with one another. That is to say, it's not as if in principle one of these rules out any of the others. It doesn't. All of them might have some grab on the truth. Now, it's not to say that they're always in complete agreement, and when they're not, then they're not completely consistent with one another. But there's nothing about their positions, for example, in this grid, that would lead to any kind of inherent conflict. So it may well be the case that, as this group that I've just named maintains, that religiosity, in fact, is good for your mental health. It's good for your physical health. It's good for sort of advertising you as a good cooperator in your society. By contrast, folks like Pascal Boyer, Justin Barrett, myself, Tom Lawson, we have advanced what you've correctly described as the byproduct position. And we can talk about that at some length if you'd like. I'll try to keep it spare here. And that is to say that simply that the forms of religious representations have some underlying recurrences, recurring kind of regularities to them. First of all, most religions seem to have myth and rituals. Most ritual systems seem to involve some activities that involve people getting certain things very, very clean. In fact, abnormally clean, one might say, and on and on. The suggestion is that the cognitive propensities that are involved here are ones that actually don't have anything to do with religion, and that they didn't evolve because of religion. They evolved for other reasons, but that once in place, it makes not just religious representations, but all kinds of cultural representations interesting and appealing to human minds. And that religions have inevitably tended to evolve to involve forms that, in fact, meet this sort of formula. You can see the kind of quickly, I assume folks in this particular audience are quite familiar with this, but I have a kind of a red question mark in terms of group selection or, natural selection at the group level. But there are folks out there who advance that, and there are even folks out there who advance that claims
Just,
about
just for the
religion.
sake, just for the sake of our audience or viewers who might not be very familiar with this concept, when we talk about group selection, we mean that there is some character that is good for the group, not for the individuals who belong to that group, right? That is the idea of group selection, isn't it?
Well, what I would say is that it seems to me, at least as it's deployed in English and the contemporary discussions these days, it seems to me the term group selection is in fact quite ambiguous. It covers lots of possibilities. It covers considerations having to do with the group and their bearing on both individuals and genes, but also groups as well. That's another interpretation, just like the one, that is to say, the one you've just advanced. This is why when we get over to cultural selection, let me see if we can, group selection is controversial. The Wilson in question here is David Sloan Wilson in his
Right.
Darwin's Cathedrals book. I've got a kind of green line there because arguably he's advancing both a story about groups with regard to natural selection and a story about groups with regard to cultural selection. Let me say just a bit more, and I think it will fit in here. There are also a whole group of folks out there who are exploring the notion that sexual selection has a role to play in explaining at least some features and dimensions of religiosity and of religions. I didn't think that there had been anybody advancing a group view until actually I saw a piece by Michael Bloom. And in fact, I think Michael, in fact, now has in fact advocated that kind of position. That position is a one that is sort of taken a little longer to get rolling. It's more sort of about a dozen years old or so, maybe 15 years. These other positions under natural selection and cultural selection have had a little more time to kind of get developed. Um, so yeah, I wanted to identify those two and those guys. We could talk about cultural selection. This is, I assume, what is in fact familiar to most of the members of this audience. I mean, this is a new movement, tremendously exciting. Um, it looks at the notion that cultural considerations could have a selective force and that could bear on religions. And in fact, it seems to me there's a lot that's, I think, quite right about that. Um, the contrast here is, yeah, content biases popped up here. Let's get a few other things here. Here's this other sort of second notion of group selection. And thankfully, the cultural selectionists, it seems to me, have done us a favor by coining a new phrase, and that's cultural group selection.
Group selection, that's right.
To try to get the notion that there could be cultural selection at the group level, and that's not the same claim as the candidly far more controversial claim that there is uh, natural selection for groups. Now, that said, I should point out it seems to me that there's an ambiguity surrounding the term natural selection. That is to say, natural selection can be all of these things. That is to say, our sexual selection and cultural selection simply species of natural selection or not. And then there may be a more narrow conception of natural selection that, for lack of a better way of putting it, let's just say, does not include those things that we might be inclined, and Darwin was inclined to account as sexual selection. I mean, he's the person who made that distinction, or that we might be inclined to treat as cultural selection. Another part of this, in fact, sort of the earliest proposals by Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson laid out a view about gene cultural coevolution. And as I said, there are sort of proposals about different features of religions that occur in every one of these cells. I mean, the parade case for gene culture coevolution, of course, is humans' abilities to manage the consumption of milk. That is to say, lactase persistence. This notion that enzymes that babies have persist, and so adults can continue to consume milk, and they've got this new source of protein. And it looks like this is an evolutionary development at the genetic level that has occurred within the last roughly 8,000 years. What these folks want to emphasize is what has come to be called context biases. Context biases are considerations that bear on how people, in effect, acquire culture. That is to say, that, among other things, we tend to be conformists. If we don't have any kind of particular knowledge in some area or some domain or in some setting, mostly what we do is pay attention to the folks around us and go ahead and do what they do. We imitate them. I mean, perhaps most famously, Joe Henrich has advanced the view about what is he and I've forgotten Gil White's first name, but Henrich and Gil White advanced this view about prestige bias. When you need to acquire culture, when culture has gotten so elaborate and developed that there's more things than you can learn on your own in your own lifetime, you've got to start paying attention to folks who might be able to transmit that culture to you effectively and efficiently. And their suggestion is it looks like we've probably got an evolved bias toward paying attention to people who possess prestige. Of course, you got to be able to detect prestige as well. But so this notion of context biases has to do with sort of who you acquire culture from. In short, who's the good teachers? Who are the folks you want to pay attention to? The content biases that my group have attended to mostly have to do with dispositions of the mind that have evolved and that have evolved for a host of different reasons. So for example, our sensitivity to the possibility of contaminants in our environment, or our abilities to pick out the things in the world that we want to attribute minds to, what in the literature is known as theory of mind, and on and on and on. The argument is that there's potentially quite a large number of these kinds of dispositions, but certainly a few. There's pretty good evidence for these, and I guess something that has become increasingly sort of criterial in my own thinking about this is where there is sort of the facilitation of acquisition. That is to say, where things turn out for humans to be really easy to acquire. And one of those things is, among other things, it looks like a caution, a wariness of things like contamination.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably more than I should have said. I apologize, but that gives you a sense of at least all the ways that I think that Darwinian modes of thought. Uh, I'm not. I want to be careful. I shouldn't even say all the ways. Some of the most prominent ways in which Darwinian modes of thought have some impact on thinking about religions.
Right. I mean, you have given us a very detailed account of the relevance of Darwinian theory in the study of this particular topic that is religion. But let me back up a little bit and go to the way in which you approach the study of human cognition in more general terms. For instance, in the first book that you published with Thomas Lawson, Rethinking Religion, you drew this distinction between interpretation and explanation, and you were saying that perhaps there has been in the study of religion too much interpretation and too much theories focused on interpretation, and what we need is explanation. But what did you mean by that distinction between one and the
Well,
other?
the way we cast it then, I've been happy to sort of stick with this formulation, and that is the notion that not only in religious studies, but I would argue across the social sciences, and frankly, I think even in anthropology, uh, uh, anthropology construed broadly. That is to say, to include everybody who counts themselves as cultural anthropologists, that there has been a pretty decided imbalance in how people have approached religious materials and religions, and that has been indeed one that has been heavily skewed towards sort of finding meanings and showing, sort of what is unusual or idiosyncratic or peculiar to various settings or to various religious arrangements. Um, what Tom and I were interested in arguing was simply, and of course, there's been a fair amount of folks who have sort of joined this plea, but that there are also plenty of things that recur across religions, and uh, that the sciences provide us with lots and lots of tools for understanding areas of human conduct and mental life, and that there isn't any reason to think that that wouldn't be just as true about religious conduct and mental life. I found myself often with anthropological audiences, um, you know, with at least some elements of that population of that community, sort of having to remind folks that for much of the 20th century, anthropology was deeply committed to trying to make a case for its scientific status. I mean, I have in mind, everybody from my former Emory colleague, Frederick Barth, to Raymond Firth or Edmund Leach or Mary Douglas, people like this. Uh, Marshall Solins early in his career. And in short, the notion was just to sort of address that imbalance and to suggest that we might have tools, and that in particular, that the cognitive sciences might have tools for providing accounts of, as I've said, recurrent features. Um, this doesn't have to be a story about claims about sort of, what's universal or essential or anything like that with religion. I think everybody who spends any time talking about religions, it has become very, very wary of proposing things like some definitive account about what's going to properly be classified as a religion and what isn't. Um, and at one level, I'm frankly not too concerned about that. That is to say, what will count and what won't count. I mean, folks have kind of, I mean, to be honest, that's my view about concepts generally. We've got a kind of rough and ready way in which we deploy them. We've got some sort of particular exemplars that we think are pretty clear illustrations. Folks are usually pretty able to agree about which ones are sort of the marginal cases and where we might be moving out beyond the scope. But the argument would be here is that the cognitive mechanisms that underlie these are not things that are peculiar to religions. Um, that is to say, again, to repeat, there are plenty of other cultural products out there that turn out to exploit these cognitive systems. And so an account of those systems provides as much or as little of an explanatory grip for those other cultural products as it does religious representations. Um, Science is the great achievement of our species, the great epistemic achievement, and the notion that we would forego it and ignore it or poo-poo it or be inattentive to it seems to me to just be a position that's pretty difficult to justify. Um, and the suggestion that we can bring the tools and methods of the sciences to bear, the biological sciences, the psychological sciences, the social sciences, to bear on understanding religious systems just like we can on any other domain of human activity and endeavor.
Right, right. Um, and another distinction that you put forward was the distinction between, but which I think is very relevant to study cultural behaviors, between what you call practiced naturalness and maturationally natural cognition. And this seems to be the opposite. Practiced natural is something that appears to be natural, but in fact it's the result of some kind of cultural learning. Whereas maturationally, natural cognition is something that appears to be learned, but it's not. In fact, it's something that grows with very little external input. So how do you define these two concepts?
If I might, I'm gonna jump to another slide here
Oh, good.
um, because this one needs to be sort of situated properly. Uh, uh, if you look at contemporary psychology and cognitive science, and by contemporary, I really mean for cognitive science almost since its birth in the 1950s, but certainly since the 1970s, um, there has been a distinction made between sort of what is known as dual processing. That is, the way that it has come to be known most recently, I think, and helpfully, is Daniel Kahneman's just labeling it System 1 and System 2.
That's right.
In his book about a dozen years ago. He called it Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, right? Um, that pertains to perception, it pertains to cognition, it pertains to action. Um, Kind of roughly speaking, it captures our sort of rough and ready common sense distinction between intuition as opposed to rather more conscious and deliberate reflection. And indeed, what I'd suggest is that there's a whole host of, in effect, a kind of constellation of uh, characteristics that pick these two systems out. Uh, I should say straight away that it may well be the case, and there are plenty of people out there in the world of cognitive science and psychology who want to argue that this is really better understood as a continuum rather than a kind of nice, clean cut distinction. And I'm untroubled by that. Which way you cast it doesn't seem to me to be that crucial. Fairly clearly, we've got to we can distinguish between things that go comparatively fast and things that go comparatively slow. Things that seem to be automatic as opposed to things that seem to be deliberate. Things that seem to be mandatory, we can't help them. In contrast to things that are voluntary, easy versus effortful, uh, mostly unconscious versus our kind of conscious verbal uh, thought. The common sense conception we have of thinking is mostly sort of the system two stuff. Um, it's the system one stuff, though, that has made, it seems to me, cognitive science such an exciting field to be involved in the last number of decades. Discovering that there's sort of all sorts of things that we're capable of doing, and yet, in a funny kind of way, we weren't even particularly aware of the fact that we were capable of doing them. I mean, one example, for example, is recognizing people's emotional states, uh, either from the look on their face or the comportment of their body or the tone of their voice. And it turns out humans can just draw a host of inferences pretty quickly on the basis of just getting a few cues about those things. Uh, they're not always right, but they are pretty, decent in most everyday settings. This is in contrast to, say, something like reading and writing. Uh, Reading and writing, if it's, for all of us, we're sort of all graybeards now, but I mean, try to remember back 65, or in my case, a little more than that, years ago, learning those first weeks and months of learning how to read. And then how to write, how to even get motor control of a pencil, let alone, so those things were very much system two kinds of operations then. What I want to suggest, and now this is kind of all preliminary, Carles, to the intro that you've just given me. So I want to clarify that for folks because implicit in Kahneman's account, and there are one or two places where he comes pretty close to drawing this distinction explicitly, but he never actually did. And I think it's in part because he didn't understand or seem not to appreciate the fact that this intuitive stuff may have two different sources. And what I've tried to suggest is that, in fact, there's a distinction to be made between practiced, what I've called practice naturalness. The system one stuff is the stuff that we say comes naturally in everyday talk. And what I've called the maturationally natural. I can't speak about Catalonian, but I can speak about English, and that is we've got a phrase. It's a standard phrase for capturing the second of these, practice naturalness. We say that something becomes second nature.
Second nature, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, this is just the development of expertise in some domain because you've had a whole lot of experience with it. You have had a tremendous amount of experience and perhaps very focused sort of system two type study. And at a certain point, as it were, activities, by the way, including reading and writing, right? I mean, after those first sort of laborious weeks and months, the first few years of learning how to do it, by now it's taken on all of those features of System 1. That is to say, we've done it so much that it's fast and implicit. When you write your name, do you think about the transition between the third and the fourth letter of your last name? The answer is no, no one does. You just zip it off. Um,
Oh, and when you see something written, you cannot help reading it. I mean,
exactly. That's the notion of things. No, that's the notion of things being mandatory.
right.
Uh, and note how reading and writing shifts in human lives and individuals' lives from being this slow, explicit, deliberate, voluntary sort of activity to becoming mandatory. As you say, if you see text, you cannot help yourself from reading it. Um, it's parallel to spoken language. If it's the case that you're a proficient speaker of a natural language, you hear these sounds, you can't help yourself from processing them as language. Um, what I want to focus on, though, is the stuff I've called the maturationally natural capacities, because that's where I think the action is with regard to sort of making some sense of religious forms and the kinds of, as I've said, recurring forms. I want to make one quick comment about origins, because there's a great deal of controversy about what the origins of System 1 is. Is this stuff? I mean, most extravagantly, folks are willing to make claims like this is innate. I've come to the point in my career, actually a long time ago, where I gave up on even understanding, being very clear about what innate means. Um, I'm more attracted to language like these are probably evolved systems. But that may not mean even that there's something that's absolutely inherent to genomes, but rather to sort of gene environment interactions, where environments have certain kind of regularities that lead to uh, the regularities in the phenotypes, the resulting phenotypes. But the notion is that at least by the time that kids are typically by school age, quite frankly, the systems in question are in place. Um, and that seems to be fairly uncontroversial. I mean, at most you find some few months of variability about when kids, for example, can pass the false belief test with theory of mind across cultures. Um, Up to maybe 6, 8 months difference from children in their fifth year of life to sort of lapping over into their sixth year of life. But pretty much to the extent that this has been tested, looking at young children's abilities to pass the false belief test, that is to say, to be able to understand that other people can have false beliefs. I could go into the details of the experiment, but I think that would take too much time. Um, this has been tested cross-culturally. Well-known paper, Callahan et al., including my colleague Philippe Rochat at Emory, that looked at, if I remember correctly, at 6 different cultures on about, I think, 5 different continents. And, lo and behold, you get somewhere between about 4.5 and about 6.5 years of age, kids have got this. And there's a pretty sort of standard bell curve there. Lots of these sort of systems seem to have a fairly regular developmental schedule. Is that a full-blown innate capacity? I'm not really very much concerned with that, to be honest. What I would just say is these are maturationally natural systems.
That would be like Chomsky's universal grammar. That is something that presumably all humans acquire as they are learning a language, but the grammar is universal, is not contingent upon the actual language that you're learning. So it's something that grows in you in a way,
Yeah,
rather
I
than.
mean, one of the points about these systems, I would argue, is that they don't turn on any culturally peculiar inputs. In the same way that that's true about language. You put the baby in America, probably ends up speaking English. You put the baby in Norway, probably ends up speaking Norwegian. Put the baby in Kenya, probably ends up speaking, I guess, Swahili. I don't know, and so on. The capacity to sort of acquire these dimensions of culture are all there. Culture, the surrounding culture sort of tunes the systems to particular sensibilities and sensitivities. Um, but those capacities don't turn on anything about those particular cultures.
Right.
Um,
Now, let me move on to the issue of religion and science,
sure.
which was the thing that you dealt with in that book I was talking about before. Uh, you say religion is natural, science is not. A priori, that seems a bit weird, isn't it? Because if you think, well, why do we believe in science? Well, why wouldn't you? I mean, you believe in science because science is true. That's it. Whereas atheists might say, well, why do you believe in religion? Because you have been indoctrinated, because you have been brainwashed. I mean, since you were born, I mean, to believe in those weird things. But actually, you're saying the opposite. That what is natural is to have religious beliefs, and what is unnatural is to have scientific beliefs. No, what's your position in this
Um,
idea of
Certainly
comparing science and
that
religion?
latter comment captures in the essence of the position. If you remember back in that slide I just showed about system one and system two, the system one stuff is easy. The system two stuff is challenging. It's deliberate. It's a lot more effortful. Um, Somebody once suggested to me that the title of the book could have been "Religion is Easy and Science is Difficult." And from a cognitive standpoint, that's exactly the argument. Absolutely. The notion is that we have a host of these maturationally natural capacities, cognitive capacities. They are, I mean, a further comment about them is that they, unlike the system two stuff, which I'll call smart, that is to say, you got to know some things. You got to have acquired culture and think about all sorts of matters and have those tools available to you to think about them deliberately. By contrast, the maturationally natural systems, I would say, are pretty stupid. Now, that's not to denigrate religion. That's not the point. The point, what I mean is this, that is to say, if they're in fact automatic, uh, we don't have any kind of reflective control over them. They just occur. We just have these sensibilities. We have these sensitivities. We have these distinctions that we draw. We have these assumptions that we make about the world, um, certain parts of the world, I should say. Um, they're also stupid in the sense that they're really cued pretty easily. It doesn't take much to sort of set them into motion, to set them into gear. Uh, and once they're cued, people know what to do. There's a whole set of inferences that come with these maturationally natural systems. So again, let's use the example of contamination avoidance, avoiding contaminants. Um, in America, when I grew up a long, long time ago, back in the 1950s and the early 60s, but it's just as true today. And I suspect it's just as true in Catalonia as well. And that is, there's a game kids play that at least we called cooties. And cooties is a game that nobody ever instructs anybody about. Everybody knows how it works. One person has cooties, and that is to say, they're the contaminant, and they run around and they try to tap other people and give them cooties, and everybody runs away from them. You don't want to get cooties, and everybody knows how this works. If you get touched, you've now got cooties, and you don't just have cooties right here where you were touched. You've got cooties all over now, and you can run around and start touching other people, and kids get a great deal of fun out of this, and absolutely. But what is it about? It's about practicing this contamination avoidance sensibilities. They're all there. Nobody sits down with the kids and gives them the rules of cooties. That isn't how it works. This just kids start playing this, and there's a fair amount of evidence they start playing this in cultures all over the world. Note the contaminant can be completely invisible. And indeed, one touch is enough to contaminate you completely. I mean, it's not as if this is just random. There's a set of systematic features about this. And again, nobody teaches kids this. Kids know this. Well, note there are a lot of ways of cueing that system about where a contaminant might be in your environment. So sometimes when people are walking from one point A to point B, but they walk circuitously to get to point B, everybody knows they've walked circuitously because there must be something about that space in between that's something we need to be wary of. It may indeed be who knows, a pool of cooties. What I'd suggest is that this is just the sorts of sensibilities that religious rituals exploit all the time. They give you these cues. You handle certain things very, very carefully, right? When you move them around, or you monitor something time and time again to make sure that it's either stayed in the same place or it hasn't been touched. This is all standard contamination avoidance capacities that, frankly, 4-year-olds have got a mastery of. 4-year-olds can play cooties just like anyone else. And this is how religious people all over the world draw the inferences they draw about what their conduct should be in such settings. I don't go to that place because that's the special place, or this is the special object. I don't touch it. That's what I mean by saying that there are recurring forms across religious systems around the world, and that they are oftentimes connected with precisely cueing these kind of maturationally natural systems. And again, to repeat, it doesn't take much to set these systems off. And once the systems are set off, all the inferences come for free. You already know this stuff, right? To use another example, language. Let's use the parade case, right, for cognitive science, and I would say for maturationally natural systems, for system one kind of cognition. You mentioned Chomsky earlier. The mandatory character of the use of language, right? I mean, if it's the case that I'm speaking right now, I'm making a bunch of noises that are, impinging on your ears. Given, I presume, I know it's true with you, Carlos, and I presume with most of the audience, even though I'm speaking English, I suspect that folks just can't help but hear this as English. And you can't stop yourself from doing it and stop yourself from understanding what I'm saying. Okay, how do religions exploit that? Well, at least in America, you sometimes have to sell this to audiences. I assume to an audience of anthropologists, I don't probably have to remind folks, but Christianity is not the only religion that involves glossolalia. Glossolalia is the phenomenon of so-called speaking in tongues. That is to say, where people start breaking out into utterances, but they're not utterances in any natural language that anybody recognizes. Now, note what happens. As soon as somebody does this around you, what happens? The systems are mandatory, right? Holy smokes, this must be language. Well, if it's language, it must mean something. Well, if it means something, I better find out what it means. Or we better be at least very careful until we have some idea of what it means. It's not a coincidence that glossolalia is a phenomenon that pops up in lots of religious systems. So I'm giving you a couple of examples: contamination avoidance, glossolalia, ritual glossolalia with contamination avoidance and our sort of penchant for the acquisition of natural language and the mastery of natural language. But the sort of the preeminent case of them all is theory of mind. Um, uh, Probably, well, in short, the gods have minds. And we know they've got minds. Not only the gods, the ancestors. I mean, pick whatever sort of superhuman agent you want. The demons also have minds. The jinns have minds, and so on. And so, no, as soon as we know that they're mindful agents, a whole host of inferences follow straight away. They've got preferences. They tend to do things that help them achieve their goals. They tend to like people who sort of agree with them and cooperate with them. And we might even enter into certain relationships with them, and on and on and on. Likewise, you know, science is filled with analytical argument, with extended, very, very tightly controlled forms of literary presentation. Um, Religions rely on stories, they rely on myths. Uh, Again, engaging theory of mind.
So,
That was the sort of gloss on the
yeah.
naturalness of religion. I can say more if you'd like about that, what I mean by the unnaturalness of science, but you take it away.
Also, if science is so unnatural, I mean, the this is a bit of a challenge to secularization theories, isn't it? I mean, the idea that, well, science is meant to replace religion sooner or later. I mean, to some extent, that is what has happened in the West, but only to some extent. And
Yeah.
uh, so, do you think that that is a challenge, really, to this idea of secularization?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. The inferences you've just drawn are right on target. The secularization theories seem to me to capture an important social phenomenon that's out there, um, that has arisen primarily in sort of Western, sort of frankly, European and North American settings. Um, I guess New Zealand also and Australia to some extent. Um, but yeah, I'm a little less convinced about the inevitability of this as a trend, a cultural trend for the Western world, for multiple reasons. The first is I write blogs for Psychology Today, and one of them was titled "God is Just a Natural Disaster Away," and there are some wonderful studies. By the way, the natural disaster can be a big collective, sort of worldwide disaster, an earthquake or a tidal wave. Actually, the great tsunami of the Boxing Day tsunami in what 2004, 2005, I've forgotten.
Right, yeah.
I mean, its ability to provoke all kinds of new religious movements in all of these areas around South India and uh, Myanmar, Thailand, and so on. It's by now well documented, no doubt, by some of your guys' colleagues. Um, but also sort of personal disasters, right? I mean, folks get very, very grim analysis about their health, and uh, suddenly there's a kind of rebirth of religiosity. Um, well, natural disasters aren't going to go away. They're always going to keep coming back. And um, there is at least some actual empirical evidence about these kinds of responses. Uh, One is a very nice study done by Joseph Abuya, in which he looks at a longitudinal study of religious attitudes in New Zealand. And it's the New Zealand government carries it out, and they've done it every year for now more than 50 years, more than 40 years, I'm sure of that. I think 50, though. Um, And lo and behold, you've got a kind of secularization pattern here, right? That is to say that it looks like over that long period of time, um, sort of what we might call average levels of professed religiosity, which is to say, what people are willing to say in response to a survey from the government about their religiosity, seems to have been in decline. A slow, gradual, but nonetheless pretty steady decline until I don't know, I've forgotten how many years ago it is now, but 10 years ago, at least, uh, until the earthquake in Christchurch.
Mm.
All of a sudden, religiosity pops back up, as particularly in that region of New Zealand. Um, so that's one reason. I'm a little less convinced that we're going to all become uh, populations of atheists who, have adopted Enlightenment liberal values and will continue on to, that secularized um, utopia. I mean, a second consideration though is this, and that is, I've got another blog, quite frankly. Folks can look these up on Psychology Today. It's called "What's Wrong with Norway." Um, and that is to say, amongst the secularization, the societies where secularization seems to have been most prominent, um, Norway is very near, if not at the top of the list. Um, well, a couple of interesting observations about Norway. Uh, One is that the most popular television show on Norwegian television is a show about people going around, people who claim to have powers, going around and basically chasing spirits out of homes. Um, Likewise, one of the princesses of Norway has now become a kind of medium. I mean, the point is that perhaps conventional religiosity has gone into, and obviously it's gone into clear decline across lots and lots of the highly developed world. Um, but it kind of ends up manifesting itself in other new kinds of funny ways that are just as involved with presumptions about invisible agents or cultural superhuman characters out there who have influence. Um, so yes, not only that, then let me add that in effect, really the real third and most, in some ways, most important argument, and that is the one that is implicit in the book, and that is science is hard. It's tough to learn, it's tough to master, it's tough to do. And not very many people do it. Not very many people master it. And frankly, not even very many people learn it. Uh, and so the notion that sort of there is a story to be told about sort of science marching onward to triumph, however much we might like to see that happen on many, many fronts in human life, um, it doesn't look to me like it's a likely scenario.
Right. Good. Well, let me ask you one a last question concerning your Gifford lecture, Religions and Their Cognitive Kin, where you said you draw this parallelism between religious figures and popular characters in popular culture. And well, something that you have already said, that the mechanism that makes them attractive is the same in both cases.
Mhm.
And your comparison was with religious figures and superheroes, for instance, that they
Yes,
are all minimally counterintuitive, and the fact that they are minimally counterintuitive makes them attractive and memorable, and so on. But then this raises the question of the so-called Mickey Mouse problem, isn't it? That
uh,
we don't uh, uh, we don't worship superheroes,
that's right.
even though they are popular, and we worship religious figures. I mean, so how do you account for that and for that difference?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think even actually, I'm a philosopher. I'm going to start out with a footnote. um, I think there are sort of intermediate cases, and sometimes I suspect that Hollywood superheroes border on this. Santa Claus certainly seems to me to be a kind of intermediate case, but all of us have the sense that somehow there's still a difference in the sort of level of dedication and the level of commitment and so on that many, maybe even most religious people show toward their gods compared to any of the folderol that surrounds either the Hollywood superheroes or Santa Claus, as far as that goes. Um, I tend to be eclectic about these things. Pascal Boyer has at times seemed to me to argue that that the inferential facility that we have with religious representations is enough to create commitment. Um, that may be, I mean, it certainly is a basis for their appeal, but the kind of full blown commitment that leads people to say, such extreme acts as martyrdom, um, uh, the considerations bearing there inspire a problem that I think is even deeper than Mickey Mouse, and that is, I mean, the point about the Mickey Mouse problem is Mickey's actually not such a great example, but say Superman or something like that. Superman has all these characteristics, these counterintuitive characteristics that tend to attract attention, facilitate memory, but not so many. So therefore, you can still draw lots and lots of inferences, and that's easy to do. And we like that. We like to do that. We love to hear stories and so on. But the contrast here is sorry, I've lost my train of thought for just a second. Give me a second. Yes, okay. I think there's a deeper problem, and I give Will Gervais and Joe Henrich credit for this, and that is what they call the Zeus problem. Um, it's not only that we don't worship Mickey and we aren't committed to Mickey, we also don't worship Zeus, and we're not committed to Zeus. That is to say, a full-fledged religious system that's out there that has just that same kind of inferential appeal as the others. And so, why is it that folks in Catalonia differentially are overwhelmingly Roman Catholic? Why is it that in Georgia, where I live, differentially people are overwhelmingly evangelical Protestants? Well, I mean, this is where I think the cultural evolutionists have made just a tremendously valuable contribution, and that is to talk about content biases, to talk about the kinds of considerations that lead people to be attracted to certain kinds of sort of cultural transmitters, teachers, the prestigious. But in particular, and one dynamic, one of these cultural biases, sorry, not a cultural bias, one of these content biases that I would argue, by the way, and I am arguing in the book I'm writing based on my Gifford lectures, that all of the biases that the cultural evolutionists point to, all of these content biases, are maturationally natural in just the same way that the context biases are that we byproduct theorists have focused on. That's just a footnote, but an important one. What they would argue is that there are other biases, content biases like this, one of which is so-called credibility enhancing displays, so-called creds. And there's ample empirical evidence that they've got this right. When people exhibit credibility enhancing displays, it tends to attract people to that position. Gee, they must really take it seriously. They're willing to die for this. This is of a piece, really. If my guess is everybody or many folks are familiar in this audience with Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity. Terrific book, really. And what, I mean, to some extent, Stark had his finger on this issue as well. He pointed out that in the ancient Roman world, when the famous plagues came, everybody noticed the Christians didn't run away to the country. They stayed there and took care of their family members and took care of their other fellow religionists. That's a credibility enhancing display. That shows you really take what you're doing seriously. And the argument is that those kinds of context biases will attract followers. And in short, your demonstration of commitment will produce commitment in these other folks. And so yeah, I mean, do the context biases produce a certain level of appeal? Yes, but we got to get beyond Mickey Mouse. We got to get beyond Zeus. We got to explain why it is that folks do all the things they do. I mean, in my area of southeastern United States, the kind of prime illustration of this is snake handling. Um, there are snake handling churches. There are probably about 100 of them across the southeastern United States. And these are Christians, believing Christians, who, as a part of their worship services, handle poisonous snakes. I would point out that this involves both context and content biases because fear of snakes is definitely one of those match-racially natural systems. Monkeys learn it in one trial. But it's a content bias it's a context bias as well. It's a content bias, fear of snakes, but it's a context bias as well, because note, this is a credibility enhancing display, if there ever was one.
Costly ritual, or how to fake a ritual. I mean, if you have to handle a snake, I mean, it means that you're really committed to what you're doing.
Indeed. And some folks have been bit and a few people have died.
Right, right.
And just a quick, I realize our time's kind of drawing to a close here, but a quick comment about this, and that is my colleague, I have a colleague who has spent a fair amount of time studying these folks. And, you know, when you present them with these considerations, they say, it doesn't matter. What the Christian Bible says is, my followers will handle serpents. It doesn't matter if we get killed by the serpents. This is one of the things that Jesus is reputed to have said about the people who will follow him.
Well, Bob, that has been terrific. We have to leave it here.
Sure.
Uh, that's all we had time for. Thank you very much. That has been a privilege
Thank
and a
you.
pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos.
Let me thank also Monse for her technical assistance, and thank you all for watching.